Good morning and welcome to the latest episode of the 1 to 10 podcast with 110 Associates. Very excited about this morning's episode. It's on a topic that I feel will be hopefully generate a lot of interest and intrigue amongst our listeners. And also I guess, delighted to welcome a good friend of mine, Simon Shipgood from EWM Global. Simon, I'll allow you to do the background intro shortly, but today's topic will be on carried interest, and hopefully between Simon and I we can discuss I guess how carried interest has become a more topical theme within the PE space, and moving forward how it can be used to kind of retain and incentivize the workforce. Simon, good morning. How are you doing?
Hey, Karim, thank you for that great introduction. Pleasure to join you. I've seen some of the guests that you've had on this podcast previously, so I feel honoured to be invited. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for making the time. So I didn't want to take away too much from yourself, Simon. So I thought we'd start with a bit of a background to firstly EWM and your role within the organisation, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So I've been at EWM now for coming up 8 years, frighteningly, but we've been around since 2001. So we're a leading fintech firm who support financial services firms to digitally transform their incentive and retention awards. And by incentive awards, I mean anything from shares, fund deferrals that you might traditionally see within asset management, to the carry and co-investment piece that we're going to talk to within this podcast. And that's really something that's come about more latterly in terms of it being viewed as a form of incentive compensation, because it is very different. It's taxed differently, it's paid differently. It's almost a form of investment as opposed to just a purely gifted incentivized compensation. But as I say, I've been here for the last 8 years, and I'm the regional director for EMEA, so supporting our clients growth for existing clients as well as attracting new clients onto our platform.
And very humbly admitted the fact that I think you've recently been recognised, right? There's a few awards in the trophy.
We did win a PEY award for the best GP incentive provider. As I say, it's a very niche industry in terms of managing not just carried interest, but I think it's the digitalization piece. We work with firms across purely financial services. So as I say, the private equity space that we're going to focus on here this morning, but that covers everything. That covers investment banks that have captive money, that covers asset managers that may have purchased private equity businesses. And then you've got the whole spectrum of firms within that private equity space that covers private debt, infrastructure, buyouts, VCs, and they range anywhere from the small 10-person organization with less than $1 billion AUM right the way up to the global KKRs and BlackRocks of the world that everybody will recognize. So we're working across a myriad of those clients, and as you can imagine, they're all at different stages of how they're managing that carried interest piece and the particular pain points that they have as a result of that.
Yep, no, understood. I guess the key question that I wanted to ask, and I appreciate it might be difficult to encapsulate into kind of one answer, right? But given that you're advising so many within that kind of private equity and fund space, and like you say, across a myriad of size and scale, what would you say is the key sales point, or how do you guys bring value to your clients, to those in the PE space?
It's an interesting question, and I think the only way I'd slightly change the question is just in terms of advising. So I guess when you think about firms that are setting up their carry structures, they would tend to do that with remuneration experts and or legal teams to actually set up the limited partner agreements behind the carry structures, whereas we're more coming in after the fact. So once the deferred incentive plans have been designed, EWM are approaching firms to say, how are you managing these? And it's really something that's evolved in terms of how manually they used to be. And I read an interesting survey by Private Equity Wire that I think was mid this year, where there was, I think the statistic was 50% of PE respondents have outsourced part of their fund operations over the last 12 months.
Mhm.
And an amazing 78% of those had felt that it added value. So, we see ourselves more as a, excuse me, an outsourced solution. So much of private equity firms' businesses have been outsourced, and you'll see this in the recruitment space, Karam. The finance teams, the ops teams, the audit, the compliance, that sort of stuff is relatively easy to get out to an outsourced partner. We're now starting to see the front office, excuse me, do the same. So, portfolio management, investor relations. I think there's so much scope now for firms and so much competition for them to view in terms of how they can outsource. And we just felt that carried interest or compensation was something that was kind of lagging behind. It was something that was kind of just left on a spreadsheet. And over the last 3 or 4 years, where we've seen so many factors now influencing the success of these firms, hanging on to talent, retaining talent, attracting talent. The fact that carried interest wasn't being outsourced and was being kept in house was something where we stepped in. We felt that there was a number of different pain points there, not just from a risk perspective. So when you've got one individual, and in those small firms that I've alluded to, and I know a number of your guests have been CFOs, it's the CFOs, it's the COOs that seem to wear so many different hats, and the whole carry admin piece just, again, it sits within their remit. And it's so if that individual, and sometimes I laugh with CFOs that say, Simon, if I go under a bus, everything is in here. There's nothing that's been systemized that we can pass on as the team grows, as the scale of the plan increases. So we need to get that out of a manual-based Excel spreadsheet and into something that's more systemized. And then the other piece really is the transparency. For all of these fantastic carry structures and carry plans that we hear of in the market, if you're not translating what they actually mean to the talent that you're hiring and retaining, you're doing a disservice to the structure that you've put in place. So that's really, for me, in a nutshell, what we're doing is we're outsourcing a pain point, but we're also helping our firms to increase that transparency of what is an incredibly important piece of the reward structure within the alternative investment space.
Yeah, and I guess just to add to that, I think the transparency piece, certainly from our side, is something that is invaluable, because so often, and I think firms have gotten better over time, but I remember if you go back a few years and you'd be speaking to candidates, and when you're talking through their comp, and I've got carry, and you're like, okay, what does that mean? Well, I don't know. Well, I can't tell you, but I've got carry. And you're like, well, unless we can quantify it or give some kind of estimate as to what you're potentially walking away from, or understanding what's vested, what isn't, like, it's difficult to then go and argue that with a prospective employer, right?
Totally agree. Yeah, totally agree.
I think firms have gotten better with it, to be fair, but yeah. And I think employees as well, right? People are a lot more savvier. So, they're not just taking that kind of carrot being dangled at face value. It's like, okay, what does this mean, right? What could it be worth? What is it going to look like for me?
Well, you would hope so, right? And I think maybe if we kind of just step back, but I'm hoping that the audience that do listen to you and I talk about this topic understand it. But the concept of carried interest is essentially just a return on the profits over and above the management fees that private equity firms would charge to keep the lights on. And the interesting thing about what we term the GP incentive life cycle, by GP I mean the private equity organization, is that there are two key components. There's actually calculating and generating the bucket of carry that you're going to distribute, and then it's that transparency piece that we're talking about. So another piece that's remained incredibly manual is actually that waterfall calculation process, and that tends to sit with the fund administrators, and those guys do an amazing job in terms of managing that piece of all of those fund transactions, all of those cash fund transactions that are coming into their system, and they're working out the return to the investor. And you've got the hurdle rate that you're applying on top of that. So of course, if you're going to park 100 million in a fund, you're going to want a preferred rate of return on that before you get into the carried interest piece. So once you've paid that back, the GP is going to take their catch up, and then you're going to do the final split at the end of that. And that's traditionally an 80-20 split. So 80 to the LPs and the investors, and then 20% to the GP or the private equity houses that we're talking about here. And then that 20%, Karam, is what's shared out amongst traditionally the deal team. But I think what we're seeing now, I know you guys are hugely focused on the back office operations of these firms. Finally, we're starting to see CFOs, COOs, heads of ops starting to take a piece of that pie. And so they should, right? Because they're absolutely instrumental in how the firms are functioning. And why shouldn't they have, exposure to that carrot, as we called it, of carried interest?
No, agreed. Yeah. So I get you kind of given a brief kind of layman's intro to what carry is, because we kind of launched into it without acknowledging that. So thank you. I mean, in terms of the 80-20 split, then is that something that's universally you see across all clients, or do you are there different permutations or variations on that? Is that just a rule of thumb, or?
It is really, Karim. I mean, Preqin, I always refer to the stats that come out of Preqin. They're fantastic. But I think the number that was quoted was about 17 trillion worth of assets by 2025 within this space. It's absolutely unbelievable. This is eclipsing almost public markets and showing a growth rate which it's almost better than GDP and inflation. So I think the focus on what firms are doing with carried interest is paramount. But yeah, that 80-20 split is traditional. 2 and 20, as it's called, 2% management fee, 20% carry. But that kind of waterfall process that I spoke about, because there's so much competition in this space, the push down, if you like, on the carry that's being charged is certainly starting to be seen. So the firms might be taking a smaller percentage than the 20. Anything down to 10 or maybe even lower. But yeah, to your point, it was always traditionally an 80-20 split, but we're certainly seeing a downward force now as competition continues to come into the market.
Yeah. And that presumably is to keep the LPs or the investors happy, right? As opposed to.
Yeah, because again, I know I kind of did a sweep of the whole carried interest piece, but essentially what you're trying to do here is align the interests of the GP with the investor. And what you'll find with carry structures is same as any form of deferred compensation, there's a vesting structure. So, these points, these percentages, allocations of carry that you get over time vest alongside the interests that you have in those funds. So you are really totally in alignment with the investors because you're in it for the long term, especially when you think about those infrastructure-based firms that I talked to, the toll roads and the utility plants that these firms are purchasing. The deal horizons on those, Karim, is way out in the future. So 10, 15 years is not unusual. And when we talk about that,
I had a client today telling me 25 years, which I was like.
But just think about when you talked about those individuals that are saying that they have no understanding of what a particular point in a carry vehicle looks like. That window, if you like, is really tough for PE firms to manage, right? During that 7 or 8 years, yes, you might be turning heads because, I didn't mention that I was in the recruitment industry before I came to EWM Global, and I remember always talking to the accountants just coming out of practice, and it was always, what's happening on the buy side? Yes, I'm attracted by the investment banks, and I think the investment banks still do an amazing job of attracting talent, but there was always that kind of head turn when you talk about the alternative industry, be that hedge fund, be that a private equity firm, and how they could get onto the buy side, and carry was a part of that, right? It was just, what does that mean for me? And I think that does still exist to an extent.
Yep. Absolutely. So going on to, coming back to from an EWM angle, then I guess first question is, why is what you guys do so important for PE funds? And I guess that would lead me on to the next question, which is, I guess, how do you go about advising clients around the management of their carry pool or carry pot, whichever you want.
Yeah, so I suppose there's a couple points there. Because these carry structures are intended to incentivize over performers as well as that alignment to the investors' interests that we talk to, there's kind of no limit on the complexity and the design. So, firms can go to town in terms of how they structure these. And when I talked about that waterfall piece, if you like, there's different hurdles depending on how the firm's performing. They can have different catch-up rates, different preferred rates of return. There's so many different things, vesting schedules. It becomes almost a headache for firms to manage these plans the more complex they are. So again, it's back to that outsourcing piece. I think where we really add value is just taking all of that heavy lifting off of the client's plates. Instead of you having to input all of these carry transactions into a spreadsheet, you're putting it into a designated database. And so,
Mhm.
when you're then interrogating that database to understand what's going on within that carry pot, you're minimizing that risk because there's no manual intervention. It's just pure transactions that are coming out of either your HR system or your fund admin system or wherever your source of truth is. But that's another point just in terms of that data challenge. We talk about outsourcing, but firms trying to centralize where the data is coming from is a headache for pretty much every single CFO and COO I talk to. So we're trying to act as that single source of truth for this very defined element of carried interest. And to your other point in terms about how we're adding value, I think the other thing I guess we could talk about here, Karim, is just the number of different ways in which you can structure carry. So you might have heard phrases when you've been talking to your candidates, deal by deal, vintage, life of fund. So that's essentially how they're setting up the structure, and that depends on how you allocate these percentages or these points of carried interest that you accrue. And the deal by deal ethos is mostly seen over with our American friends over the other side of the pond, and it's where you're allocating points at an investment level. So for each deal that individual is involved in, they are receiving a point allocation or a percentage for that that deal's return. So potentially one deal might be performing better than the other, and those individuals may be paid carried interest sooner than others. If you're you're working on a non-performing deal, it may be that you're not getting a return of carry quite so quickly. But the other piece of complexity that comes there is once you even that out across the performance of the fund, there might be an element of clawback. So you might be incentivized somebody with a carry payment and then having to take that back. So again, managing that without software, without a trusted partner, is a very difficult process. So what we're seeing now is the market may be moving towards more of a life of fund structure, where you're essentially aggregating the performance across the entire fund before you pay out any of that carried interest. So it's an aggregation of all the deals, those that are performing and those that are non-performing, and then only then is the carry paid out. So from a candidate perspective, you can probably see the up and the downs there. If you're only getting paid on the investments that are performing, that's great for your high performers. But if somebody's on a non-performing deal, potentially that can create issues. So again, utilizing a piece of software or a system such as ours, we're helping them to manage that process of the point allocation. The more complex it becomes, be it deal by deal for each investment, or be it life of fund, again aggregated across the entire spectrum.
Right.
And then the final one to talk to is just vintage. So that's the last out of the three that you really see, where you're allocating points on a yearly basis. So again, you're tying those performance fees to a different set of points based on a year's performance. And the reason that we're seeing a lot of vintage allocations now is because imagine when you've got constant movers, leavers, and joiners. The fund is obviously building up value, and you're moving into a situation where you're potentially in carry. So you've already paid back the investors, as I've said, you've got over the hurdle and you're in carry. And if a new joiner comes in as an immediately granted points, imagine that might cause some fractions with individuals that are saying, well, hey, we've worked pretty hard on this deal, and individual X has walked into the firm and has taken a portion of that. So we're starting to see firms now with vintage allocations. So on a yearly basis, they're allocating a new set of points. So again, you're just trying to tie in individuals to performance to the piece that they've actively been involved in.
Yep. Okay. Cool. And I'm guessing for that, with the systems or the models that you guys are using, it's constantly evolving, right? Because as these forms of payment, shall we say, evolve and change, then the system needs to be equally kind of nimble and adaptable, right? In order to deal with the changes in complexity.
Yeah, and I think again, I have to say it's not something that isn't manageable on an Excel spreadsheet, but we find that there's a point where a fund gets to, let's say 2-3 funds with maybe 15-20 deal team members, or maybe larger if they're offering it to a wider pool within their business. And it's just the sheer volume of the transactions and that transparency piece that we talked to. If you're not feeding a valuation in, the points don't mean anything. So you can say to Karim he has 2 points, but if you're not valuing the portfolio that's based on, what does it actually mean? So I think by systemizing this process, we're freeing up the time of whoever's managing these carried interest in co-investment schemes to say, right, Now we can work hand in hand with our administrator to say, let's put a value on this. Instead of doing something on an annual basis, let's do it on a quarterly basis. Again, so you're giving that more dynamic view of what an individual is potentially building up in terms of their wealth at the organization. And I hope that by doing that, you're avoiding, and I don't mean disrespect to you guys, but halfway through the year, I'm seeing what my carry's worth. Maybe I won't pick up the phone to a headhunter. Maybe I will realize that I'm in this for a long term. So yeah, I think that transparency and systemization is integral to this retention piece that we keep alluding to.
Yep. So what are the challenges or objections then that you often face from prospective clients or client, because ultimately I guess your challenge, Simon, is to go in and in theory, what you're offering is fantastic, right? But as with any kind of, I guess, sales geared business, clients will either always know better or have someone else that does it or whatever it may be. Going back to your earlier point, right? The CFO that's got everything up here, and isn't perhaps thinking about the prospect of maybe one day being mowed down by a bus. Right, so for him, it's or her, it's up here, it's cool, right? It's great. So what are the challenges you guys, or not so much challenges, but what objections do you guys hear or face when discussing, I guess?
It's a great question, because I really enjoy that part of my role, which is speaking to prospective clients, as we call them, that aren't already utilizing our platform. And same as you, I love these webinars. I love conference attendance when you get to talk to CFOs about where their pain points are. So I think the phrase for me that always makes me smile is Excel does still excel, and there is nothing like it. And I have so much respect for qualified chartered accountants that have been through just hell to get those qualifications. So to be able to manage an Excel is an absolute breeze for these guys and gals. So they can absolutely manage this process curve on an Excel spreadsheet. I just think it gets to the point where as you continue to scale up, as you continue to grow and add funds, and in that piece we talked about in terms of how often am I able to put a valuation in, it's doing that at an aggregate level instead of doing that for every single individual that you have in the plan. I've got to know CFOs over my time as a recruiter, which was 15 years before EWM, and they're now my friends that are in very senior finance positions, and they're coping with it. But then they'll open up their spreadsheet and say, Simon, this is now 40, 50 tabs long. And if I put something in tab 1 and I forget to copy and paste it across the 50 tabs, there's a potentially material error in there, or there's risk to the firm that we're not completing this correctly. And then you think about the audits. The auditors come in and saying, well, how are you actually auditing this process of managing the carry? Well, it's in here. Instead of being able to show auditable tracks, generate reports from a system generated database, you're just again adding that tick for the compliance and the risk guys to say, okay, this is working as it should. So I think that's the first one. Then it's the complexity. Some of these structures, although I've alluded to the fact that they can be complex, some of them aren't. Some of them that are points that are allocated at the beginning of the lifetime of a fund, and they may last for 10 or 15 years. And that's quite manageable on a spreadsheet. If you're just taking points away and you're forfeiting it back to the house account, you can manage that for the time being. And I think firms are under so much pressure with other improvements in terms of where they're digitally outsourcing or digitally enhancing all of their operational processes, that the carry piece can fall down the list. Yes, it's important, but it's just something that's maybe not quite as important as getting the new HR system or the new compliance system or the new, fully automated fund accounting back office solution. There's a whole list of things there, Karan, that firms are also looking to achieve. I think one of the other biggies is the concern about how long it would take to implement. I talked about the fact that data is just such a big deal for firms in terms of how they have one single source of truth. And I think firms are nervous about how long it will take to get all of that information off of a spreadsheet and into a system. And that's not just for us, that's for any form of outsourcing that you're doing. So there's a pushback on that. And then I guess it's just trusting the system. It's the auditability of what you're putting in, right? That kind of waterfall calculation piece that I talked about at the head. If you don't have any way of tracking how you're working out those hurdle rates, how you're working out that GP catch up, what that final split looks like, I think there's a nervousness about putting stuff into a black box and what pops out the end. So, we're trying to build a system that gives you those auditable checks. It gives you a tab to say, how can I reconcile back to what information is coming out of the system? So, there's a whole myriad of really good objections, but you made me smile when you said it sounds great. It does, but you realize that you're not always the priority on a CFO or a COO's, to-do list.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I know that feeling very well. So just to bring it across to kind of, I guess, from a people perspective, certainly on our side, Simon, we are now, and I think you alluded to it earlier about how traditionally carry was for the deal guys and girls, deal teams, sorry. And over time you've started to see it trickle down so that heads of ops, CFOs, COOs are now kind of participating. I think on our side we are seeing firms are becoming a lot more cognizant of the fact that people within finance, ops, middle office, back office, whatever you want to call it, are playing their part in the success of the firm. So we are seeing more and more this kind of carry tool being used as being incorporated into packages, shall we say, for candidates. So what are your thoughts on that? And I guess is it kind of, for me to just kind of label it as an incentive to either attract or retain talent, is that me kind of almost being a bit ignorant and downplaying it, or is it exactly what I've maybe said it is?
No, I think it's a great question, and I think ultimately that's what it has to boil down to. It's part of the expected package, if you like, of working within a private equity firm. And I guess if you think about your process of interviewing a candidate, and you're talking about firm A and firm B, and firm A can say to the individual, we can absolutely give you a full 360 view of what your compensation transparency will be at this firm. We can talk about the plans that we have in carry. We can talk about what your points would be, what that percentage allocation would be worth. Versus somebody on the other side that can say, firm B, we may be only giving you a paper-based annual statement once a year, and that's based on a valuation that we expect you to do yourself. It seems a bit like a no-brainer, right? To be able to provide that level of 360 transparency. I mean, what's my salary? Are there any other benefits or bonuses? Digitalizing compensation has to be as important as all the other things that firms are starting to do so well now, in my opinion. Working from home, flexible working hours. I think firms are finally realizing the importance of human capital, and compensation, of course, is only one part of that. I've seen the private equity business shift so much over the last 7 years, and you do the same as me. Whether we like it or not, we're trying to generate sales at times, trying to increase growth of our business. And talking to COOs and CFOs about carry, they were just saying, with respect, Simon, I've got so much more on my plate. Suddenly I've got 80% of my workforce operating outside of the main office. I've got a huge office here that's laying empty. I've got risk and IT all over me saying, well, how are we managing the data exchange between individuals now working at home? There's just so much that firms have going on. So I think, to boil down carry as a retention and incentive tool, it is what it is. It's an expected part of a private equity package, and it's something that should be totally transparent to the individual that's receiving it.
So with that in mind then, Simon, I guess if you were advising a candidate who's just received, let's say, a job offer where carry has been mentioned, how would you advise that individual in terms of, I guess, interrogating the worth of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question. And again, with my recruitment hat on, that's probably something that you're going to be talking about at latter stages of the conversation. I think if you wander in and immediately start saying, well, what's your carry structure? I don't think firms would be at all find that strange for them to ask about, out of the funds that you have, how many of those are in carry? I mean, maybe even ask the question, what form of transparency are you providing to individuals that hold point allocations? There's the concept of realized versus unrealized value. Now, realized is obviously where it's been crystallized. So part of the fund or the investment has been sold, resulting in what's called a distribution that then flows through that waterfall that I talked about, that crystallizes in carry that's paid down to the individual. How much of that has actually occurred, or is everything that you're talking about now just a what if scenario? Because imagine you can plug in data to say, if the firm returned 5x, 4x, 6x, this is what your point could be worth. So I think there's an element of sensibleness that needs to be applied here. But to interrogate firms on how they're calculating those valuations, how are you putting a value on a potential NAV now if you sold everything or liquidated everything in the fund, just to give yourself an idea of what those percentage allocations could potentially be worth. And then I think, Karim, as well, ask about the structures that I talked about. Are you deal by deal? Are you doing this life of fund? Are there vintage year allocations? Because the other big conversation around carries is its taxation. It is a form of investment, especially when you think of the co-investment structures where senior individuals can actually invest their own capital alongside the fund, and that may or may not be leveraged by the firms. So the firm can provide additional leverage to say, instead of 100,000 against the fund, you've got 200,000. Obviously that gets paid back and interest is paid on that. But again, for an individual to ask about, do those schemes exist? Is it deal by deal? Is it life of fund? It's going to give you a picture of what your potential wealth creation could be at that firm.
No, understood. Cool. And then I guess we've touched upon, I feel like I'm going to go ahead with the question. I feel like you've touched upon certain aspects of it already, but I guess for us going forward, and one thing that I'm constantly saying to clients, and more so clients these days, when they're asking why about the shortage of candidates, right? And one of the things I kind of mention is that firms have gotten so much better at kind of retaining their talent and valuing their talent, right? And for me, you mentioned as well earlier, it's not always about the money, right? So I do find that top talent seems to be very well motivated and challenged professionally, in terms of the breadth of the role or the scope of the role that they've been offered. At the same time, tools like carry are being used to kind of financially get that kind of longer term buy-in. So on the basis that carry is going to continue to be used to kind of compensate and incentivize and retain private equity professionals, what would your thoughts be on how firms can monitor and manage their own carry pools as best practice? And I guess this is, you've already touched upon digitization, transparency, but I guess for you going forward, as an individual or as a business, how would you advise clients to kind of keep on top of whether it's a growing carry pool, whether it's changing complexity, etc.? What would your view be?
And I've tried, I don't want this to be too much of a sales pitch, but I think it's the simple answer to that, Karim, is leveraging technology. I think if you're not leveraging technology, you are missing a trick, because yes, individuals can cope with managing this on an Excel spreadsheet, but when you think about the reporting that is possible when you have a dedicated database, so you're interrogating the database to pull out not just the granular day-by-day details in terms of what are the ratio allocations, where do the vested points go, how am I tracking all of the myriad of vesting schedules, when I'm doing a payout, what's the split of that payout, are there any additional transactions or upfront tax distributions that I need to take into account? All of that is manageable via a manual process. But once you put that into a system, being able to interrogate that database to pull out, as I say, a granular report, or more latterly now what we're offering is analytics. It's saying, well, let me look at a defined calendar period. Over that calendar year, how was the carry structured? Not just geographically, but on gender. So you can start to analyze the gender split of how the carry is paid to ensure that you are doing the correct split right the way down from the top to the bottom of the organization. Even factors like ethnicity. I think there's so much data that we can take into the system so that firms can start to track just a myriad of different reporting requirements, but then they can start to really provide not just analytics, but they can start to forecast, well, what if we did get a certain return? What would that look like in terms of the shape of the carry pool? And then when you start to create that level of information at your fingertips, then you can really leverage the transparency. You can have the portal that we have to say to individuals, you can always log in and see what your salary is, see what your bonus was, see what your base is, and see what you're accruing across all those deferred schemes that I talked about. So think about a buyout firm. It's not just carry that they're offering. In some instances, they're offering shares in the underlying portfolio companies that they're buying into. Again, give them transparency of what that's worth. It might be a listed company, it might be, again, a private valuation, but if you're not feeding that into a system, it's impossible for you to give that visibility to the individuals that you're trying to attract and retain. So for me, it really is about leveraging technology, but doing it in the right way. And I think that, you think about regulations that are now starting to apply to some of the smaller asset managers and private equity houses now. I don't think this requirement for reporting is going to go anywhere but in that direction. And certainly reporting on performance-based compensation, carried interest, that's only going to get tougher. And I think if firms can't leverage technology and interrogate a database instead of trying to run something manually on a spreadsheet, that's going to become very difficult for them to manage.
No, yeah, definitely. It's to your point, I guess, the requirements, everything's increasing, right? The requirements around reporting are increasing. The volume of data that's involved in these kind of businesses is increasing as well. And as is often the case, to your point, it is tech that's, I guess, leading the solution, shall we say?
There was an Ernst & Young survey. Again, I think it was beginning of this year, and they graded the firms. I think there was 15 billion plus, between 2.5 and 15 billion AUM, and then less than 2.5 billion. And they graded them across what their strategic priorities were, and that included the things that you've talked about there: tech, middle office, back office outsourcing, ESG, another biggie. But the one that came out on top for all of them was talent management. And that comes in so many different forms, right? Talent management. It's how you empower your workforce. But then if we're just talking about our purely compensation-based piece, it's how you attract and retain them. It's how you stop those individuals from walking out the door. Because as we've said, there's so much good stuff going on at the firm, and you're being adequately recorded for it as well. So, I think it's clearly not something that's going to go away anytime soon in terms of that focus.
No, absolutely. Perfect. All right. And look, I feel like we've kind of touched upon certain things, but we probably only hit kind of the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, right? There's probably a lot more to this as a topic, and kind of, Simon, you've been really helpful in terms of defining certain terms as well, right? So appreciate that. Any kind of final thoughts from your side in terms of, I guess, where we're headed where's the landscape headed with carried interest? And is it a case that it's going to continue to evolve and develop as in line with some of the ways that you've said, or are there any other issues kind of bubbling away in the background that might be worth considering for clients out there?
I mean, I think the biggie that's often not spoken about is the taxation on it. This so-called carried interest loophole, if you like, the fact that it's taxed as capital gains and not as income. I think that co-investment has started to really grow in terms of where it's offered across these firms, where it is genuinely a form of investment. You're investing your capital alongside the vehicle, so you've got skin in the game, and rightly so. It's an asset. It's an amount of cash that is being taxed as such. We are starting to see much more of these synthetic type structures, where, as I said, it's normally been because there has been inherent value in the plan before an individual has joined. So it's very difficult to then allocate points for a myriad of reasons, including how it's taxed. So it's just almost run as a synthetic plan to say you're going to get this paid through income tax, but you are still basing the value on the performance of the underlying funds. So again, that may be something that's offered across more than just the deal teams in terms of that synthetic structure. And we may see more of that, especially our larger clients. But the one that really interests me is I've been to so many conferences and heard individuals talking about the impact of ESG across their investment landscape. And I think that's now starting to proliferate into operations in terms of, you know, the governance, the sustainability, and how we're treating the workforce. And I'm really interested as to how ESG starts to work itself into carry, because I've spoken to senior individuals at firm and said it'd be a very brave firm that ties purely carry to how you performed in terms of your ESG criteria, and to say to you at the end of the year, hey Karim, well, unfortunately you missed a couple of ESG criteria, we're going to reduce your carry. That would be a brave firm. But what we've seen is a really interesting nuance with those co-investment schemes that I've talked about, where you think about firms that provide leverage, so they'll loan alongside your initial capital investment, and they'll do that obviously at a rate of interest return. If you're hitting your ESG criteria, you can potentially lower the rate of interest that's charged on that outstanding capital. So a nice way to tie in the performance under that ESG criteria with what is a very, you know, comprehensive part of the incentive attraction. So watch this space. I think I'm constantly amazed to see how ESG is starting to infiltrate all areas of the business, and it'd be interesting to see how it makes its mark on carry.
Yeah, no, interesting times ahead. Simon, look, we'll wrap up because I'm conscious of not taking up too much more of your time, but thank you so much for joining and sharing your thoughts with us. And no doubt, I guess, if there is anyone out there that would like to find out a bit more or discuss their transition from either their Mind or Excel onto a more kind of digitized platform, then I'm sure Simon will be more than happy to kind of discuss that with people. But thank you very much, Simon, and
thanks, Karim.
Look forward to catching up soon. Take care.
Thank you very much. Take care.